Okay, so let's get started. So welcome to 677 Distributed and Operating Systems. Today I'm just going to do a quick overview of what this course is about and tell you about the syllabus and just some course related issues. Okay, and then we'll actually start talking about distributed systems starting next time. Alright, so I presume all of you have registered. If you haven't yet registered and you just came to see what this class is about, come see me at the end of the lecture because we are close to capacity, but there's a little room. So in case there is some demand to get in at the last minute, you haven't registered, you should come see me now before we fill the course up. Okay. So let me start with a quick introduction. So my name is Prashant Sinha, as you probably know already. I will be the instructor. We'll have other course staff. One of them is going to be the TA. His name is Shin. That's his picture. I'm going to have him come to class next time just so that you know who he is, or at least now you know what he looks like. I will also announce office hours for the TA next time. Okay, my office hours are going to be immediately after this class on Mondays, okay, in my office, which is upstairs in this building. Okay, you can always come see me at other times, but I would appreciate that you email me and make an appointment if you cannot come during office hours for any reason. Okay, so that will be the two of us. We may have some graders at this point. I don't know who they are going to be. I will announce that when the time comes. Okay. There are two resources that you need to be aware of for this course. One is the course web page, which I'm going to show you. Okay, there is a URL there. I will post course materials on the web page. Okay. Much of that is going to get mirrored into Moodle. So it is okay if you just go to Moodle and follow along, but typically what I do is I post a permanent copy on the web page, and then we also put a link from Moodle. So you have the same material show up in both places. Okay, the Moodle courses are not permanent. My web page just stays forever. So course web page. So this is why I have two repositories. So that's the primary, and you will see all of whatever appears here also show up on Moodle. I'm going to show you the web page in a little bit. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about the course. Okay. So we are going to use a textbook, which I'll talk about in a moment. So the material that we cover in this course are primarily based off on the textbook. Okay? There will be several advanced topics that are not in the textbook, which I will cover as well. And we will give out handouts or additional readings so that you have some extra material to review those topics. Okay? So the initial set of topics are all core topics for any distributed and operating systems class. So that's going to just follow right from the textbook. Okay? So we will start with the introduction. So some of that is going to happen today. There's just a definition of what distributed systems are, how they've evolved, a little bit of a history behind distributed systems. Okay? And then next time we'll talk about distributed architectures. Then we are going to go into communication. Okay? So that's basically how distributed applications interact with one another. In that context, I'm going to talk about remote procedure calls, remote method invocation, message stream oriented communication, and so on. Okay? If you don't know what these things mean, don't worry about it. We will get to them and we will look at them in quite some detail. Okay? Then we'll spend quite a bit of time on processes, threads, but from a graduate level perspective. Okay, you probably, if you've taken an undergrad class in operating systems, you know what processes are, you know what threads are, and so on. Here we are going to look at more advanced concepts that relate to processes and threads that have to do with code migration, process migration, virtualization, and things like that. Okay, so that's what we will do in that topic. We'll briefly spend some time talking about distributed naming. I'll talk about DNS as an example of a very large naming service. So we'll see why you need directory services and naming services in distributed systems. Okay, so those are the initial set of topics, and we'll continue from that point on and move on to this topic that I call canonical problems in distributed systems. This is really a core part of the course in that we will look at several problems that arise in distributed systems at an abstract level. These have to do with things like leader election and mutual exclusion and a whole set of these techniques that you have to employ whenever you design any distributed system. We look at them at an abstract level, but then we'll also see how they are instantiated in the context of a real system. Do you mind moving? There is a camera behind. Okay. So that's and clock synchronization, whole bunch of these topics. We'll spend a good set of lectures looking at this topic. Okay. So, and then at that point on, we will then go and look at more applied stuff. So we'll look at replication and caching and consistency, which are all techniques that are used in real systems to achieve performance or other optimizations. We look at fault tolerance, which is the problem of when failures occur in your distributed system. How can you ensure that your application doesn't stop functioning, that it continues to run despite some components failing? What kinds of principles should you apply in your distributed system to make that work? Okay. If time permits, we'll talk a little bit about security, and I have de-emphasized that topic some because there's a graduate level course in security that looks at all of those issues in quite some detail. But if there is time at the end, we might spend a lecture or so talking about security. Okay? And then there are some advanced topics which include distributed middleware, it includes web, the World Wide Web, cloud computing, green computing, multimedia, mobile computing. We can't do them all. Yeah, that's quite a bit of material right there. But we'll look at some of those topics. And if you have any specific interest in any or some of those, you can let me know. I can tailor. That comes at the end of the course. Okay, so we can tailor the content based on what you want to see as well. Okay. So that's basically the set of topics that we will cover here. Okay. And you'll see that much of that follows the textbook, which I'll talk about as well. Okay. There's a textbook which is Distributed Systems, 2nd edition by Tannenbaum. Okay, that's what we will use for the course. If you have bought a copy, that's good. If you haven't, I could put a couple of copies on reserve in the library, which may be adequate. That will be fine as well. Okay, we will also give out notes and whatnot. Okay, that's going to be coming from the lectures. Okay, so I list it as a recommended book, not a required book, because I let you decide whether you really want to spend the money buying it. It's not cheap, so it's your choice. Okay. As far as this grading is concerned, there are going to be some homeworks that we'll give out that just allow you to refresh your review the material, make sure you understand the concepts and so on. It will be about 12% of the grade. Okay. Class participation is about 3% of the grade. Okay. That basically means that you shouldn't just sit and listen, you should ask questions. Okay, because the only way to actually learn this is to make the class interactive. If I just sit and stand here and talk the whole time, we are not going to actually get much out of the course. Okay, so it's better that you ask as many questions as you can. That makes the class actually much more fun and enjoyable and interactive. Okay? And if you actually participate, you actually get some points at the end of the course. Okay? I will also seek volunteers to take notes. We'll have class scribes who will actually take notes on whatever I am actually talking about in the course. Okay? And if you volunteer to be a scribe, you will also get some class participation points for actually contributing to it. And at some later point soon, I'm going to send out a request, and you can just sign up for a particular lecture. And then for that lecture, you have to take some notes, write it up, and then we make it available to everyone. Okay? Not a lot of effort, but just a little. Okay, so those are homeworks and class participation. Much of the course grade is going to be based off on programming assignments and the exam. Okay, so there will be, it says 3 to 4, but typically there are 3. Okay, so for a lab or programming assignment, that take up a substantial chunk of the grade, which is about 45%. Okay, so 15% per assignment. And then there are going to be 2 exams, a midterm and a final exam, that collectively constitute 40% of it. So 20% for each test. Okay. Final exam is always take home, okay, which means that It's going to be given to you. You have 24 hours to work on it yourself. You can take any reference that you find anywhere. Use that for the exam, but you cannot talk to anyone other than you. Okay? When you take it. But that's the way final exam is going to be structured. The midterm is closed book, unlike the final, which is obviously open book, and the midterm will be an evening exam. Okay, that I'll actually hold in this class sometime in the middle of the semester, some late March or there. I'll announce the date for the midterm soon. Okay, so midterm, closed book, closed notes, in class, final exam, open book, open notes, take home. Okay. The date for the final is always the date when the final exam is scheduled by the university, which I believe is April 29th. Okay. If you look on Spire, you'll see the date for the final exam. Last time I checked, I think I saw April 29th. I'll double check that. Okay, but that's the date I'll give out the final, just so that you know if you want to plan for internships or whatever else you need to plan. Okay. Any questions on the grading scheme? Okay. So few other things. There's a class mailing list that's created automatically by Spire. If you're enrolled, you're on the list. I will use that to make periodic announcements. You can also write to the mailing list, but there's some etiquette that I've suggested that you don't ask questions about personal matter that get broadcast to everyone. Okay, those are just best sent to me, not sent on the mailing list and so on. Yes.
Are you assuming that we should collaborate or not on the programming assignments?
Programming assignment, I will let you know. There are some that I allow for group work. Okay, in that case, you can form groups of 2, not groups of 3, just groups of 2, and those you can always collaborate. It depends on the assignment, which I haven't decided that some might be just individual. Okay, but I do let most of the labs be done in groups of 2. Okay, so you don't have to be part of a group, but you can. Okay. Any other questions about the programming assignments? No. So course mailing list is going to be set up. You're going to be on it. You don't have to do anything. Moodle is what we will use for you to turn things in. Okay. Everything that you turn in, which is homeworks, programming assignments, you don't turn any physical copies. You just upload to Moodle. That way things don't get lost. There's a record and there's a timestamp of when things came in and so on. Okay, so we'll use Moodle. I presume all of you know what Moodle is. Okay, I'm going to show you the first page in just a moment for Moodle. And then the last thing you need to know is we use this system called Piazza for as an online discussion forum. Okay, that's like a place where you can go ask questions. They can be answered by other peers in this course. We can answer them. So it's a place that you can actually go for help. Okay, you can always come to me, but there's questions that you just want to post on the bulletin boards, you can do that. Sometimes others answer it even faster than one of us gets to. Okay, so we use that, and then once it's answered, everyone else can see if you want to get a clarification for a lab assignment, for instance. Okay, you can post those kinds of questions on the bulletin board. Okay. Now the only thing to keep in mind is you have to actually enroll for the discussion forum. Okay. Which essentially just means that you go to Piazza. If you don't have an account, you create a free account, and there's a link for the course which I will set up today, and you just say I am enrolled in this course, and it just adds. Okay, there's nothing else that you need to do. Okay, at that point, you can actually ask questions or see what others are posted. Okay, so this you have to do, otherwise you will not be part of the discussion forums. Okay? So that's basically most of the course logistics. The last thing to keep in mind are the prereqs. It is assumed that you know material from an undergraduate class in operating systems. I don't enforce this. I don't check that you have actually taken an undergrad class. I just assume that if you have not and you want to take this class, that's fine, but it's your responsibility to look at an undergraduate textbook and read it and keep up. Okay? Most of the time, it's not a problem, but if you haven't taken a class and you have questions about whether you can keep up with the material, you can come talk to me. Okay? So it is a suggestion that you, it's an assumption that I make that you will actually know concepts from an undergrad OS class. Okay? Especially when we come to processes and threads and so on, I'm assuming that you know some of those basic concepts and we are going to build off on that. That's the place where you really need to know a little bit. Okay? Some of the other concepts are not parts of distributed undergrad OS, but those are fine, but some basic concepts you do need. Okay, so that's the first one. The second prereq is, of course, that you need to know some programming. 45% of your grade depends on it. Okay. As far as what language you pick to write your assignment, as you will see when we hand out the assignment, we are going to let you have some creative freedom. We are not going to say you have to do this in C, C++, Java, or whatever. You can pick your language, okay? And you will have to make that will be one of your design decisions, okay? As to what language you pick. You can use Java, you can use, or people have used all sorts of languages, Python, C++. You can use any of those things, okay? And your design decision will influence how much work you have to do to complete the assignments, okay? If you pick good languages that have good feature sets for whatever is being asked, it makes your life easier, okay? But that's something you have to pick, but you have to at least know that language, because since you're going to be writing fairly sophisticated code using that language. Okay, so programming skills are assumed at this point, that you know how to do some programming. Language is your choice. Okay? Any questions? Right. So that's about it. As far as the syllabus is concerned, I'm going to show you these two things that I said I would. Okay, so this is the Moodle page. You know what Moodle looks like. The course page is live. If you're enrolled, you should have access to it. You'll see that today's lectures slides are already there. So you don't actually need to take a lot of notes typically. You can print the slides before the class. If you want to, come to class and just annotate the slides. I'll try to post them before class on most days. Okay? As I said, all the homeworks, everything will be posted there and you will have to turn these in there. Okay? The other resource is the course web page, which as you will see is also live. So you will see that there are all sorts of information that are put on the slides is all there. The syllabus is also here that I described to you in the past few slides. Everything that I mentioned is all there. Take a look at it, make sure you understand the course expectations and so on. Okay, also, as I said, the lecture slides are also posted here. They will be cross-posted to both places as I mentioned. So you can go to either of those two resources. Okay. You will see that we are recording the class. Okay, so class recordings will also be made available typically 1 or 2 days after the lecture. Okay. I just do this so that you have an extra resource to go back and look. Okay, this is not a reason to stop coming to class because my name is too early or something like that. Okay, you can, I don't have any attendance here, but if you don't come to class, you will get less out of the class. Okay, that goes without saying. Okay. So, and all of the recordings will also be posted there in addition to scribe notes and all of it. Okay, so that's the class web page. There are some other things here like supplemental readings where I will provide additional pointers to material and so on, okay, from time to time. So that's the two set of resources that you do need to know. Okay. I'm going to take a pause here to see if there are any questions before I start talking about introduction to distributed systems. Anything, any questions about the class, logistics? Okay. All right, so let's get started then. We'll talk about what are distributed systems and why you should know about them. Okay, so as it turns out, okay, most of the systems that you use on a day-to-day basis today have become distributed in some shape or form. Okay, here are several examples. So the web is an example of a very large global scale distributed system. The Google search engine is another example of a distributed system where you can type a keyword search and hit submit. It goes to the Google system that runs on literally hundreds of thousands of servers around the world. Some small number of those servers process your query, provide the results come back to you, and you see those results. Okay, so that's an example of a see whether it's Amazon or any of these sites. Also run on lots of different servers. They are distributed in some shape or form. If you use peer-to-peer systems, BitTorrent or many others like that, they are examples of distributed systems. Okay? There's SETI at home, which I'll get to later. There's cluster computing, grid computing, all of these are examples of distributed systems. Okay? You use email, whether you use any other application on your phone, typically if there's a server backend, that's an example of a distributed system. Okay, or the social media apps are examples of distributed system. So lots of applications that you've already been using on a day-to-day basis tend to be distributed in many different ways. Okay? And if you want to build large-scale application, not a small app that just runs on one machine, but anything that communicates with any other component or anything like that, okay, you need to know what distributed systems are, how they are built, okay, how they work, and so on. Okay? That's a reason for you to know about distributed systems. So it allows you to understand how real-world systems work. Okay, all of those examples, how they work internally at a basic level. Okay, and then what are some principles for designing your own? Okay, if you go out into industry, okay, or you may be doing a systems research project which involves writing a distributed application, you need to understand how to build them well. Okay, you can always build something, but if you want to build them well, so they are robust, they're fault tolerant, they're scalable, all of those things, you need to understand the principles behind building good distributed systems. Okay? So that's a good reason for taking this class, okay, to understand how real world systems work. Okay? Now with that background, let me define what I mean by a distributed system. And this is the textbook definition as well. So essentially, a distributed system is a set of CPUs that are interconnected, okay, and that they work together to achieve some common goal. So it's a collection of independent computers that appear to its users as a single large system. Okay? The way we have defined distributed systems is very broad. Okay? We said there are two components. There are computational units, which will, let's say, CPUs, okay, and there is a communication medium that allows them to communicate with one another. Okay? Now, this very broad definition allows us to look at different kinds of systems and map it into a distributed system. Okay? In particular, if you look at parallel machines, okay, practically any machine that you buy today is parallel in some shape or form. So even your phone has two cores on the CPU these days. Okay? So if you have multiple cores and you have a high-speed interconnect that lets the applications that are running on this course communicate with one another, that from our definition is an example of a distributed system. Okay? It's also called a tightly coupled distributed system because everything that is running on this distributed system is actually running on a single physical machine. Okay? The CPUs are inside a physical machine. The communication medium is a high-speed interconnect bus, okay, that allows them to communicate. Okay? That's called a tightly coupled system. Okay? More common version of a distributed system is where the CPUs are actually independent machines. Okay? They could be servers, they could be desktops, they could be laptops, they could be phones, and whatnot. The communication medium is an actual network. Okay? It could be a local area network, it could be a Wi-Fi network, cellular network, doesn't matter what the network is, or a WAN or the internet. It's a network of some sort, and these machines actually communicate with one another over that network, and the applications that run on the machines use them for communication. Okay? That's an example of a more traditional distributed system. Okay? It's also referred to as a loosely coupled distributed system. Okay? We are mostly going to focus on this class of systems. Okay, where the machines that the CPUs are on independent machines, okay, as opposed to parallel systems where the CPUs are cores and interconnect as a high-speed bus of some sort. Okay, so that's what we mean. The definition is broad. Both parallel systems and loosely coupled systems fall into that category, but by and large, we are going to focus on the latter. This is not a course on parallel systems or parallel programming, which is slightly different set of concepts. But our definition does encompass even parallel systems. Okay? Alright, so why build systems in this way? So as you can imagine, in contrast to having a distributed system, you can have what are called centralized systems, okay, where everything just runs on one machine or one core or something like that. Okay, so you can have machine application be centralized or they could be distributed. Okay, the question is, what do you gain and what do you lose when you go from a centralized system to a distributed system? Okay, so here are some advantages and disadvantages, okay, that we have. So one advantage of making things distributed is you can write applications that allow you to communicate. Okay? You can use email or you can use chat application, you can use social media application. They all allow you to communicate between users. Users use applications that run on their machines and they use internet to communicate. Okay? So it enables communication. It enables resource sharing. Okay? So what we mean by resource sharing, resources on one machine can be shared and used on another machine. Okay, if your application or system is distributed, resources on one machine become available for use on another. Okay, so what kinds of resource sharing might we think of? You have examples you can think of.
GPUs.
Okay.
GPUs.
Okay, so how do you share a GPU on another machine?
So it's like you have multiple GPUs spread across different machines, and you have a large parallel program to be run. So the parts of the program can be spread across these different GPUs, and the results can be then integrated.
Okay. So one example being given is a sophisticated example actually. I wasn't thinking that complicated, but be that as it may, that is an example of resource sharing where you have GPUs, okay, that are hardware resources on multiple machines. Single application comes in, okay, it basically gets partitioned into smaller tasks. The tasks are sent off to individual GPUs. You compute the results, you bring it back and get your final answer. And that's an example of sharing hardware resources across machines to achieve by a distributed application. Okay, that's one example. Anything simpler than that you actually used?
Disk space.
Disk space. Okay, so disks are very simple examples of how you can actually share resources. If you have access files that are stored on a server, okay, if you have a network drive that you mapped onto your machine, that's an example of resource sharing. The files reside on a remote disk, not on your local disk. It is accessing files stored on a different machine. Okay? Very simple example. Network printers, another example. Printer is connected to a different machine. You can just print from your local machine, laptop, tablet, laptop, desktop, and send off a print job. And this allows you to share a printer across multiple machines. You don't need a printer attached to each individual machine. Okay, lots of very simple, straightforward examples that you already encountered of resource sharing. All of this becomes possible because your system is distributed. Okay, so that's resource sharing. You get better economics, better price performance ratios. So if you want to scale your application to large numbers of users, there are two ways to do this. Okay, one is you buy a bigger machine, okay, that has more CPU power, it has more memory, more disk, and so on. Okay, and then you can run your application on this high-end machine. Or you get lots of cheaper machines, connect them together, replicate your applications on lots of machines, and run it that way. Okay. The latter is a more distributed approach. Okay, when we talk about cluster computing and so on, you will see that the latter approach gives better price performance ratios. Okay. High-end machines also are expensive. Okay. You can buy many lower-end servers and connect them over high speed, let's say gigabit Ethernet. You get the same amount of computational power at a much lower cost. Okay. So you get a better price performance ratio. That's one reason. So the first approach was centralized, the high-end machine, a single machine. Okay. Second way to scale is you actually partition your application on lower-end commodity servers. Okay, that gives you better price performance ratio. Okay. You can get better reliability and better scalability. Better reliability says if your application is running on n different nodes, n different machines, if one or some number of them actually fail, okay, the application as a whole can continue to run. Okay? So long as the application is built so that the other machines take over the tasks that were performed on the failed machine. Okay? If you had a centralized approach, your application is running on a single machine, the node fails, then the application stops functioning. There's nothing you can do at that point. But in a distributed case, your application can continue to run even if some fraction of your machines are down at any given point. Okay? So that gives you better reliability, it also gives you better scalability because you can also keep adding machines to your system, and that allows you to scale the capacity of an application and so on. Okay, when we come to the web, you'll see how to do some of these things, okay, how to scale application capacity and adding machines and so on. Okay, that also gives us the final benefit, which is potential for incremental growth. Okay, your application when it starts off, distributed application may not be very popular, it may not have a very high request rate. Okay? So there is no point going and buying a very expensive server and spending a lot of money when you are not going to use the resources of the machine. Okay? A better approach to scale is you start off by running your application on a small server. Okay? Your application actually becomes popular, it starts getting more users, let's say it's a game that you build, and let's say your number of user base keeps growing. At some point you might saturate the capacity of one server. Okay? You can then add a second server or some additional number of servers that increases the capacity of an application. Now you can keep doing this and keep growing the capacity over time. Okay? This allows you to invest resources only when you have to, and you don't have to go and spend a lot of money upfront buying a big server when you don't know what the future demand for your application is going to be. Okay? So that gives you potential for incremental growth as well. Okay? Those are all benefits. Okay? Now that doesn't mean everything is great, there are no limitations or anything like that. There are indeed several limitations or drawbacks of building applications in a distributed fashion as opposed to, let's say, centralized application. Okay? So here are some disadvantages. The first one is the system that is going to be used to run your application, whether it's programming languages, whether it's the operating system or the middleware, all become more complicated because they have to enable all of these benefits, okay, for you. Okay, so your underlying systems are more complicated to design and build. Okay. Anytime your application is distributed, network connectivity is essential. Okay, if the network dies, okay, some parts of your application may become unreachable. Okay, so let's say you store your files on a remote disk. Okay, the server goes down. Okay, the files are no longer accessible when the server is down. Okay, so network connectivity is essential in this scenario. Okay, and then the last disadvantage, which is an important one, is security and privacy. Because applications are distributed on multiple machines, okay, and each machine is accessing resources or other parts of the application on another machine, this opens up security loopholes. Okay. It allows hackers to also go and access unauthorized data, unauthorized systems and so on, because everything is now accessible over the network. So remote adversaries can get into your system and steal your data and whatnot. Okay. So this is an important thing to keep in mind when your distributed system. Security is important. You have to design your application so that it stays secure and whatnot. Okay, that complicates your application design, okay, as opposed to having a centralized application. So these are some pros and cons. Are there any questions before I move on? Okay, so hopefully by the end of the course you will agree that the advantages outweigh the disadvantages and distributed systems are indeed good. Okay, the disadvantages were worse than the advantages, you would never build applications this way. Alright? So with that, let me talk a little bit about transparency in a distributed system and also talk about how they have evolved over time and whatnot. Okay? So what do we mean by transparency in a distributed system? So like any system, a distributed system has several properties. Okay? And then the question is, which of these properties are you going to expose to your end users and which ones are you going to hide from the end user? Okay? If something is hidden from the end user, you say that you are basically transparent along that axis. Okay? And if you actually expose it, then you are not transparent. I'm going to give you some example. Okay? So let's take an example of replication. Replication simply means that is your application, your distributed application, is it replicated? Is it running on more than one machine? Okay. Simple example is a web server. Okay. You can replicate a web server on 3 different servers. Okay. When a user makes a request, that request can be sent to any of those 3 servers which can service that request. Okay. Because all 3 machines are running exactly the same server code. Okay. So you can send your request to any of them. Okay. So that's what replication means. Now the question is, are you going to expose the fact that your application is replicated to your end user or not? Okay. And you can design your system either way. Okay. If you hide the fact that the application is replicated, then your system in this case is replication transparent. If not, then it's not transparent. So what does this mean? So let's say you decide not to hide the fact that it's replicated. So in this case, the user has to explicitly pick which replica they go to. Okay, so you can say server1.cs.umass.edu or server2.cs.umass.edu or server3.cs.umass.edu. When you actually make a request on your browser, you have to actually decide which of these 3 URLs you are going to send the request to, and then your request will go to one of those 3 servers. Okay? In this case, your system is not replication transparent. Okay, you expose the fact that it's replicated to the end user, and the user actually has to make a decision which replica to use to service your request. Okay. On the other hand, you could just say www.cs.umass.edu, and something internally figures out that this URL is actually not one server, but underneath it's 3 servers. It figures out which of those 3 servers to pick, and your request goes to one of the 3 replicas, and your request is satisfied by that replica. Okay. In this case, the user is not even aware that there are replicas underneath. Okay. The system is taking care of it for you. Okay. This is a replication transparent system. Okay. The user is not aware of this replication. Okay. So you could build your system either way. There are pros and cons, as we will see. Okay. So, but that's what replication transparency simply means. It means that is the fact that your system replicated hidden from users or exposed to you. Okay. And this table shows you many other such properties of a distributed system. And the question is, when you design your system, you have to make a choice. Is it going to be exposing that factor to the user, or is it going to hiding some of those details? Okay, so you can have location transparency. Okay, well, that location essentially says where is the resource located. Okay, that could be an IP address, or it could be something else. Is that going to be exposed to user, or is that going to be hidden from the user, and the user just provides some abstract request saying I need this resource, the system figures out where it is and gets it for you. Okay, so that's what location transparency means. Migration transparency says if for any reason you decide to move a resource from one machine to another, are you going to expose that to the user or not? A simple example may be the disk that has, let's say, your home directory files on the server becomes full. Okay, the disk space has been exhausted. The system administrator decides, let's move some data for some users from one disk to another. Okay, so now some of your files are moved from one disk to another. Is this going to be exposed to the user? Because now the user needs to say, my files are now on a different disk, so I have to recreate my network drive mappings. In that case, you are not migration transparent. On the other hand, the file server could take care of it for you. Okay, you can use a more abstract name and just map it to the new disk, so the user doesn't even know things are moved underneath. Okay. Then you are migration transparent. Okay, so you can build your system either way. And so with concurrency transparency, which says is the system concurrent or not. Failure transparency, which says when things fail, will the system automatically recover this, so users don't have to worry about it, or the users have to take steps and reconnect and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so there are many different properties. I'm not going to go into all of this now because we haven't actually looked at them in any detail. Only thing you need to understand at this point is when you design your system, there are going to be numerous design choices. Okay. And an important part of the design choice is what aspects of your system do you expose to users and what are you going to hide. If you hide something, then the users don't need to worry about it. You take care of it internally. Okay, so there are good reasons to hide things and not complicate your system design, but in some cases it's good to expose a few things to the user so they get to choose as well. Okay, so that's a balance that you have to achieve. And so we'll come across many of these in more detail as we go along. And right now, all you need to know. Any questions here? Okay. So we will move on. We'll talk a little bit about open distributed systems and then hopefully move on to some historical. Okay, so there are what are referred to as open systems and closed systems. And by that, what we mean is in an open distributed system, each component exposes its interface to other components. The API that you use for each component to talk to other components is made public. So other components can talk to it. You can write components that use the APIs to talk to other components, so on and so on. Okay? So many systems these days actually follow an open model where the API to interact with that component is published. Okay? Simple example, maybe let's take Google Maps. You probably all know what Google Maps is. You can go and look up a map. They typically use a browser-based interface to interact with Google Maps. Okay? Google Maps also has an API that allows you to make requests as methods, and then it will return results. Okay? You can use that API to embed a map into your web page, for example. Okay? If you want to embed a map there and say these are driving directions to come to, let's say, the computer science building, you can use that by using the API. Okay? In this case, the API is public. Okay? It's published, so you can just use that and embed a small map into your application. That's an example of an open system. Okay? Closed systems typically don't disclose their interfaces. Okay? The components do interact with one another, but the interfaces are not made public, okay? And only the designers of the system know how to use the system. Okay? So typically most systems that you see that are out there are becoming more open. APIs are published, so you can use that to build other neat applications and so on. Okay? So that's something to keep in mind. We will come back to this when we look at real systems later. Okay? But let's talk a little bit about scalability. Okay? So I said that one of the advantages of a distributed system is that it's scalable. Okay? So what did we mean by that? So there are actually 3 ways to scale your system. Okay? You can scale it on the service dimension, the data dimension, and the algorithm dimension. So let's take a centralized version of all these 3 systems. So if you have a centralized service that says that you have a single server for all your users. Okay? And the contention is that that will not scale. Okay, is that clear why? Why is a centralized service not going to scale? Yes.
The server has its limits.
Okay, server has its limits. Anything else? So as you can imagine, if you basically send lots of requests to the server, it's going to get overloaded after a point. Okay, as you send more and more requests, the load is going to keep going up. At some point, you're going to hit saturation, and then your server is not going to be able to service any more requests at that point. Okay? So centralized services will not scale. If you make the service distributed, you run it on more than one server, hopefully the collective capacity, aggregate capacity of those multiple servers is more than that of a single server. So you will be able to service more requests. So one way to scale your application is just run it on more than one server. Okay? That's not going to solve all of your problems, because there are other places where your system might actually not scale. So let's take data. Okay? So here is an example, centralized data. So it says maybe you run your application on more than one server. Okay? But underneath, if that application is accessing the same data, and that data resides on a single disk, that's going to be a bottleneck for your system as well. Okay? So you might have a distributed service with centralized data. Okay? Data, let's say it's a database. You know what a database is. So if you write a web application, okay, and you run the web application on 3 servers, but when requests come in, each of those 3 servers actually makes a query to the database to answer that request. And the queries go to a single database server. The database server is now going to be a place where your scalability problems are going to arise. Okay? So basically, if you have a distributed service but centralized data, you're still going to have scalability issues. So you can distribute the data as well. Okay? You can ensure that you have more than one copy of the data. You can have more than one database server, replicate your data and so on. In that case, if you have a distributed service and your distributed data, you are going to be able to scale. Okay, but that doesn't solve the problem. Okay, you might actually have a distributed service and distributed data, but your algorithms may still be centralized. Okay, what that means is that if you basically run some code on your servers, if the algorithms that are actually being used to process requests are centralized, that will still introduce a central point of failure, or not failure, but rather a scalability bottleneck. Okay. So examples of centralized algorithms are doing global routing in a network. Okay. Or you might say when a request comes in, all replicas have to talk to one another to figure out how to service this request. Okay. If you introduce algorithms that are not designed to scale, that cannot make local decisions, that have to communicate with other replicas in order to make any decision at all, you're again going to have scalability issues. You can run your application on multiple servers, but if these components have to all communicate to service every single request, that's going to introduce another point of failure. So you want to have local decision making, which is just decentralized algorithms. Okay, we'll look at examples of centralized and decentralized algorithms so you appreciate this better. Okay? But the point on this slide is it's not very straightforward to scale your application. You have to really think about what is in the application. Okay, what is the service, where is the data, what algorithms are being used by the server, and ensure that you scale along all of these axes. Okay? Simply saying I'm going to basically, the server is overloaded, let's just buy another server and run the application on two servers doesn't necessarily solve the problem, because your data may be not distributed. Algorithms may not be distributed and so on. Okay? So we will look at good ways to design distributed systems, but the point here is it's not trivial. Okay? You have to really think about the design of your system. Okay, so again we are going to come back to scaling quite a bit, so I'm not going to delve into this much right now, but here are some principles that will actually allow you to avoid pitfalls that I described on the previous slide. So one is no machine should have complete state. You should make local decisions rather than having to coordinate your decisions. A single point of failure should not bring the system down. There should not be what's called a global clock. Okay? We haven't actually introduced some of these topics, so you may not even know what a global clock is and so on. But as we go along, you will actually encounter some of these topics in a lot more detail. But these are all things you need to keep in mind. Okay, decentralize the state or distribute the state. Use local information, not necessarily say everything. You need to have global information to make decisions. If some components fail, the system should not go down. You should depend on a single clock and so on. Okay? And the techniques you can use are asynchronous communication, distributing state and algorithm. You can always use caching and replication. Okay, these are all independent topics that we are going to cover. Some of them are entire chapters in the book. Okay? But once you understand all of those concepts well, you can put them all together in designing your system. Okay? So you need to resort to quite a few different things in order to build robust, scalable, distributed systems. Okay? Questions? So let's move on. So I'm going to do a little bit of a history lesson at this point, which will tell you how systems have evolved, or how distributed systems have evolved over the ages. Okay? So the very early distributed systems go back, I think, maybe 3 or 4 decades now, to what was called the mini computer model. Okay? So what happened? So very early machines were mainframe systems. Okay? They were very large, very expensive machines that were centralized. Okay? They cost millions of dollars to build, and they did not have the ability to distribute anything. Everything ran on one machine. Okay? And then as computer technology evolved, you could buy cheaper machines, which are called mini computers. They were much more stripped down servers, okay? And they had the ability to communicate over a network. Okay? In those days, networks were actually dial-up networks. They basically used phone network. One machine would literally make a phone call to another machine, would establish a connection over a phone line and communicate at very low bit rates. Okay? But that was the way you could actually communicate. But even this very rudimentary model allowed you to build early distributed applications. Okay? Simplest examples of very early applications was email. Okay? You could now send a message, okay, as an electronic message, which is what email means, to a user on another machine. Okay? Typically what would happen is you would write a message and submit it to your mail server. It would be queued up because this was pre-internet. Machines were not always connected. Okay? By and large, they sat in isolation in a disconnected mode, and every once in a while, this machine would then decide there are outgoing messages to a user on that machine, so it would basically call up that machine. Literally, as I said, make a phone call, have a connection, then when connection is established, transfers the message to the other machine, then it would be sent off to the user. Okay? So this is how you could actually build a way for users to communicate. Okay? Email was a very early example. There are many others like that. You could actually share files using file FTP, which you probably know about. So you could put up a files on some server, other users could actually connect to your server, log in, download files or upload files. So this was one way you could actually share large files. Okay? So FTP, databases, email servers were all early examples that allowed users to talk to other machines and then either send messages, access data and so on. Okay? So those were the very early days of distributed system. Okay? And as you will see that as technology evolves, things get better. Okay? So from mini computers about 10, maybe 2 or 3 decades ago, machine prices fell to a point where you could actually put a workstation on each user's desk. Okay? This was basically mostly there used to be a Unix workstation in the pre-PC days. And when personal computers came along, so workstation essentially became a personal computer, a PC of some sort. Okay? Now, once you had workstations, you actually could connect them on a local area network of some sort. Okay? Ethernet being a good example. Okay? So now you had machines that sat on a network. The network was always connected. These machines could now instantly send messages to any other machine on the network. That opened up a whole new set of distributed applications that went beyond email and FTP and so on. Okay, so for examples, you could submit a job. Okay, you could say, I need to run this simulation for my research, submit it to your workstation. If your workstation was already overloaded, this job could then be sent off to another idle workstation somewhere on the network. That idle workstation could execute your job and send you back results. Okay? So this was the early days of distributed computing, where computing was no longer centralized. You could send off tasks to other machines could execute them, send you back results and so on. Okay? So when we talk about systems like Sprite, in a few lectures from now, you will see how some of these early systems would schedule jobs on remote machines. Okay? So that was the workstation model. Okay, which is there even today, except that your workstations are laptops and tablets and phones, not necessarily desktops. Okay. So from there arose what is called the client-server model, which is a very popular model for building distributed system. Okay. So in the client-server model, what happened was users had workstations, but workstations were not always the most powerful machines you could buy. You could buy more powerful machines, which we will call servers, and also put them on the network. Okay? So rather than users processing all of their work locally on the workstation, you could send off more heavy-duty requests off to more powerful machines, which were servers. Okay? That gave rise to client-server computing, where clients would make requests or send work off to servers. Servers, being the more powerful machines, could execute that request or perform the task and then send back results. Okay? And that is there even today in the context of the web and all of these other things that you see. So client-server model is still very popular, okay? But that's how it arose from the workstation. Okay? And then from there, as prices of hardware fell, you didn't have one server, but a large pool of servers where when you submitted some request or a job, you could pick one from a pool to execute your job. And this was called the processor pool model. Okay? So there in this processor pool model, sometimes the clients were very lightweight. Okay? This is also called thin client computing, okay? Where you did not need a heavy duty machine just to submit a job. Okay? You could have a lightweight machine. All the work was actually being done by remote servers. And there were lots of them. So there was a pool of servers that were all processing requests on behalf of users. Okay? This kind of model even exists today in the context of cluster computing and so on, as you will see. But in the early days, this was referred to as the processor pool model, which was an evolution of the client-server model, where you had a pool of processors acting as a server. And the clients that didn't have to be heavy duty, they could be lightweight. Any questions so far? Okay. So from there you have more modern versions of distributed systems, all of which exist today. Okay. So processor, pool model, arrows, client, cluster computing. Okay. Cluster computing, the cluster is essentially a set of servers that sits in a machine room or a data center. You submit, it can run one or more applications. You can then send off requests to your cluster, like applications execute a request, send back the result. Okay. So that's essentially what cluster computing means. We'll of course talk about it in more detail. Grid computing is a generalization of cluster computing where there are more than one clusters, not necessarily in one location. You can take a bunch of these clusters that exist in different organizations or different departments within an organization and interconnect them. Okay? So one cluster can then send off requests to other clusters if it's overloaded, and clusters can talk to one another and so on. Okay? So that's essentially a cluster of machines that is connected over a network. Okay? This is a cluster of servers on the same local area network. Okay? So there's a difference between clusters and grids. Okay? And from grids you have WAN-based clusters and data centers and so on, which is basically what modern applications, whether it's Google or Facebook or Amazon, they all use lots of clusters and lots of locations that are all connected by very high-speed networks that are all working together to achieve some common task, which is run some suite of applications. There is a search engine or Gmail or any of these things that these applications run. Okay? And then we have other more modern versions of this, which are cloud computing and so on, which also we'll talk about, okay, in the context of this class. Okay. So that's basically an evolution of distributed systems from its very early days, when all you had were machines that could communicate with other machines over a phone line, okay, to very powerful sets of machines, groups of machines or clusters that communicate over the internet or very high-speed networks and so on. Okay. That's the computational evolution of distributed system. Okay. Now this evolution has continued in ways, in many different ways, and there are other kinds of distributed systems that have arisen that you might not even think of as a computing system at all. Okay. And this is basically what we will refer to as distributed pervasive systems. Okay. As hardware prices have fallen, okay, it is very inexpensive to put a computing device, okay, maybe a tiny sensor node with a tiny computational capability, into practically anything you can think of. Okay? So today a car is a distributed system, okay, because it has lots of microprocessors. It actually has a local area network, okay, in it. And that fits our definition of a distributed system, which is a collection of CPUs interconnected over a network. Okay? And the CPUs in a car are monitoring all sorts of things. It basically monitors how the engine works and whether the tire pressure is right and whether to activate the airbag in the car and all of those things. Okay? So that you don't think of a car as a computer at all, but it is actually a distributed system the way modern cars have evolved. Okay? Your phone, you have lots of these devices, phones and iPods and tablets and all of these things. Those are all basically fall under this category of mobile computing, which are all mobile devices. Okay? Most of those devices actually talk to some other devices, typically servers, okay? Which gives you another example of distributed systems. Okay? These are all low-end devices, so if they need to do anything heavy duty, they essentially go to a server to perform the task, whether to store large amounts of data or perform lots of computation. Okay? You can have other kinds of networks like sensor network that are also examples of distributed system. So in this case, your tiny sensors that have communication capabilities. You can even put them in the environment. You can actually get these sensors to monitor how much you walk or how much you run and all of this kind of stuff. They're all examples of pervasive distributed system. Okay? They are tiny computing devices that have the ability to communicate with other devices. Okay? So there are all these examples that you see today, okay? Which if you think about it, you don't actually think of them as a distributed system at all, but they are in some shape or form. They are more resource constrained nodes, not a laptop or a server, but they are computing devices. Right? They have communication capabilities, and they will basically fit our definition of a distributed system. Okay? So just to, that's sort of where the history lesson is going to end. Essentially, to such a low price point that you can embed computing and communication into practically any physical application you can think of, whether it's a house, whether it's a car, or even the ability to track your own health using all sorts of fitness trackers and so on. They all fall under our category of a distributed system. And towards the end of this class, we are going to come back to some of these more newer forms of distributed system and look at them in more detail. But initially, we are going to focus on the more traditional types of distributed systems. Questions here? Okay. So let me now talk a little bit about the operating system, the software side of things, because I talked about what is a distributed system. I talked a little bit about how they evolved over maybe the past 40, 50 years. Now let me talk a little bit about the operating systems that run on these machines, how they have also evolved over time. Okay? So we are going to start with uniprocessor operating systems. This is what a traditional undergrad class in operating system should have covered already. Okay? So in this case, what do we mean by an OS? And an OS is essentially the software layer that runs on a machine, okay, that runs on top of the hardware and provides easier to use abstractions to its end users. Okay? Users, when they use a machine, don't directly deal with the low-level details of the hardware. Okay? They actually deal with the operating system using its abstraction. Okay? One abstraction you can think of is a file. Okay? When you create some data, you put it in a file, okay, and you don't actually worry about where on disk is the file stored and how it is stored and so on. That is dealt with by the OS. Okay? Or when you start an application, okay, or start a new process, you actually don't worry about how it runs on the CPU and so on. The operating system takes care of running it on the right processors and so on for you. So the OS is essentially a resource manager. Okay? Is the software layer that is going to take care of using the hardware resources based on whatever request the user makes. Okay, so it manages a CPU, I/O devices, memory, and so on. It provides this easier to use logical abstraction of files and processes and address spaces that end users actually get to use. End users don't need to worry about low-level details of the hardware. Okay? So OS takes care of it for that. Okay? Now, with that definition of an OS, let's take a look at how some of these operating systems have also evolved over time. Early operating systems used what was referred to as a monolithic architecture. Okay? What that means is the operating system kernel was one large distinguished process that ran on the machine. Okay? All the code for the OS was actually part of that one large process. Okay? Everything that the OS essentially provides was embedded in this one process that boots up, and then that's your OS that's running on the machine. All other processes actually interact with that OS, and so do the users. Okay? So this basically was how early operating systems were built, although that gives you some good advantages, especially from, let's say, the performance standpoint. Building operating systems in this form is not always desirable. Okay? You're putting all your functionality into one large kernel. That essentially means that from a software engineering standpoint, making new additions, adding functionality to the OS is actually quite complicated. As a kernel designer, you really have to learn lots of different parts of the kernel to even understand how to make some change, whether that change can have a ripple effect and impact on other parts of the kernel and so on. Like in any large software system, if you're working on some large software system that's a commercial product, if it's not modular, if it's built in a monolithic fashion, any small change can actually have some unintended consequences. It can impact code in other parts of your system. Okay? So as a result, the design of operating systems evolved from being monolithic to being more modular and being more structured, okay, over time. Okay? One way to achieve that modularity is what's called a layered design. In a layered design, you take your software system, whether it's an OS or any other system, and you partition it into layers. Okay? Each layer, the layers are stacked, so each layer can only talk to the layer above it and the layer below it. Okay? So layer I will talk to layer I plus 1 and I minus 1, but not other layers. If layer I needs to talk to some other layers, it has to go through the layer above it or below it in order to get to the other layers in the system. Okay? That's called a layered design for designing any software. Okay? That's one way you can build your distributed system. You take the system, you partition, or even operating system. You take the system, you partition it into components, you layer them. And you basically, now each layer is designed independently. It has well-defined interfaces it uses to communicate above and below it. So you can make local changes so long as you don't change the interface, nothing else is going to break. Okay? That's a good way to structure your system so that it's not, doesn't have some of the disadvantages. There's one way to modularize it, there are many others. Okay? Here's another way to build a modular operating system. Okay? This is referred to as a microkernel architecture. Okay? This is how some operating system designers believe all operating systems should be built. Okay? In the microkernel architecture, you take your operating system kernel, you partition it into components. Okay? And then you have what is called a very lowest layer is referred to as a microkernel. So it's a very compact kernel that is only going to provide you some very basic minimal set of features. Okay? Everything else that you associate with your operating system is actually going to be built in a separate component that's actually going to run as a separate user process on that system. So your file system is actually a user process. Your CPU scheduling is a user process. Your memory management is a user process. They all work together, okay, as part of one larger operating system using the microkernel. So the microkernel provides communication abstraction. It lets the file system talk to the CPU scheduler, the CPU scheduler can talk to the memory manager and so on through communication abstractions provided by the microkernel. So the microkernel only provides inter-process communication and security. Okay? And everything else is now built outside the operating system. Okay? So now if you want to make a change to the file system, you only need to learn this process, okay, and its code. You don't really need to worry about anything else. Another way to modularize your system. This is an extreme way to modularize your system. Each component is made its own user process. Okay? It's referred to as a microkernel architecture. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about advantages and disadvantages of this architecture. Can you think of some reasons you think this is a good idea or a bad idea? Yes.
Maybe it was slow.
Slow?
Well,
377. Yes, there's something.
security is just as if you have access to one part doesn't mean you have access to the different.
Okay, so we have one advantage and one disadvantage. One is performance, the other is security. I'll talk about them in a little bit. Any other ideas why this is good or bad?
Is scalable?
Sorry?
Scalable?
Okay, scalable if you have more processes. Anything else? Okay, so I'll talk only about two. There are many advantages and disadvantages. The primary ones are performance and security. Okay? So an advantage of building it this way, okay, is it, or at least the OS designers who believe in this approach claim that it is a more secure way of building operating systems. So for example, let's say like any piece of software, the OS is also going to have some bugs. Okay? If you had built your OS in a monolithic fashion, where all of these components were part of one large kernel, okay? And there was a bug in any one of those components, if a hacker could exploit that bug, they gain access to the entire kernel. Okay? They essentially become root on that, super user on the system, and they can take over the machine, okay, or bring down the machine. If there is a bug in one of the components, when you have a microkernel architecture, it only impacts that component but nothing else. Okay? It isolates the impact of that bug to that one process, because there's process boundaries. You cannot go and do something else to another process because you took over this one process. Okay? So this is in some ways a more secure way of building operating system and indeed any large application, where you partition the application into independent processes. Okay? A real world example of something like this is early versions of the Chrome browser. Okay? The Chrome browser, each tab was actually at one point its own process. Okay? So what that meant is if some malicious code ran on one tab, and let's say you had online banking being done in another tab, the malicious code in this tab couldn't go and steal your data in another tab because they were independent processes. It looked like one application was completely independent. As opposed to this, if you had a monolithic browser and you had some malicious code or JavaScript injected into the browser, it can look at any part of the browser, any sessions that are ongoing and steal your sensitive data. Yeah, so that's just the real world example of exactly what you see in a microkernel architecture. Okay. So that's security. That's an advantage. Disadvantage is performance, because you're highly structured and highly modular in a microkernel architecture. Every component is its own process. So now when the OS has to perform any task, a lot of these components have to communicate with one another. Okay, that means explicit message passing. That if a CPU scheduler has to talk to the memory manager, it has to make an explicit request by sending a message. The message has to go down to the microkernel and come back to the memory manager and so on. That is going to consume some overheads. Okay. In a monolithic architecture, if one component needs to invoke another component, you simply make a function call. Okay. The memory manager may have an API, internal API, you simply call that method. Okay. Function calls are cheap, messages are not. Okay. So this is going to have a high performance overhead. So in other words, microkernels tend to be slower than monolithic kernels. Now many of the commercial operating systems that you see today actually at some point or time became microkernels. So Windows, early versions of Windows were actually based on a microkernel called Mach, which was an early version of this OS built in CMU, and so was Mac OS X. Okay? But because the performance problems were so great, what some of these commercial OS designers started to do was saying, performance is slow, how can we speed it up? They said, let's take some more essential components and move it back into the kernel. Okay, so that performance does not get impacted. But some other components you can actually leave out of the kernel in a more microkernel fashion. Okay? So it's more of a hybrid architecture where you're trying to push functionality that you had extracted out back in the kernel for performance reasons. You're willing to make the security performance trade-offs. Okay? So modern kernels are some variant of an old microkernel architecture that they started off with. And more functionality has gotten pushed down. They're still modular because they use this notion of modules to build independent components that can be dynamically loaded or taken out, but they are not as secure as a microkernel, and the module is an independent process. Okay? Questions? So we are still in uniprocessor land. Okay, we haven't moved to distributed systems yet. So now let's talk a little bit about distributed operating systems. So this is an OS that's going to run on a distributed system. Okay? And we'll see many flavors of this. We'll see in particular 3 different variants of what we will call a distributed operating system. They will all sort of do similar things. So the purest form of a distributed operating system is going to manage all the resources in your distributed system as if it was one large centralized system. Okay? So in this case, if you had, let's say, n machines, the kernel on these machines are going to be distributed, okay? But they will present an abstraction of a single logical larger machine to the end user. The end user may not even know that there are n machines. They just log into a logical machine and they are basically then using all the resources of a physical machine. This is the purest form of a distributed system, which is even hidden the fact that there are multiple machines. Okay, there's hardware level transparency where you don't even know. Okay, you are not actually logging in or doing SSH to an independent machine. You are logging into a logical machine. Okay? And the OS has actually hidden the fact that there are multiple machines underneath. Okay, so that essentially looks like a centralized OS, operates on multiple independent CPUs, provides all kinds of transparency. Okay? In fact, you have hidden the fact that there are even multiple machines at all. Okay? That's the purest form. Now, that is hard to build. Okay? So what you actually see in practice is some relaxed versions of it. Okay? So distributed operating system is basically a tightly coupled operating system that essentially hides the fact that there are multiple machines at all. But what you actually see in most cases today is what is referred to as a network operating system, not a distributed operating system. Okay, in the network operating system world, you actually have independent machines that run their own OSs. Okay? but they have communication capabilities. You can actually access resources on another machine, you can log into another machine, and so on. Okay. So basically, all the OSs that you see today, there's Linux or Windows or OS X, fall into this category because it has a networking component. It provides additional features that allow you to access resources or access other machines, but they're not hiding the fact that other machines exist. If you want to access another machine, you might have to SSH into. Okay, so it's not providing the transparency, but you can actually still use other resources and whatnot. Okay? That's a network operating system. And a middleware operating system essentially takes what is a network operating system, adds a software layer on top to provide some of the benefits of what a pure distributed operating system could provide. And I'm going to show you some pictures to make this a little more clear. Okay. So here is an example of a distributed operating system, okay, where you have these multiple machines. There's this distributed OS layer. Once you have anything on top of this, cannot actually see that these are three machines, A, B, and C. It just looks like one large machine with 3 times the processing power and maybe 3 times the RAM and so on. Okay? So it's essentially hiding the fact that independent machines exist. An example of this is what is called MOSIX, which also gives you a single system image across a whole cluster. Okay. Here is a network operating system picture. Okay. So in this case, you have a kernel, and you have network OS services that allow you to do remote login and all these other things. Okay. Applications that run on top are aware of the fact there are independent machines. They have to use them explicitly. And you might say, send a request to machine B and have it perform this task. You just don't say execute this request and have the OS take care of it for you. The presence of machines is actually visible. Okay. And then here is a middleware-based system where you take a network operating system and then you run a middleware layer. That's a software layer that to certain distributed application pretends like a single large logical machine. Okay. So you are, in this case, you have the option of just using this as a network operating system and explicitly being aware of the presence of machines, or some applications run on top of this middleware software layer, and that middleware takes care of some of those details for you, as if it makes it look like a distributed operating system. Okay? So this is essentially what you will see today. Either you will use this as a pure network OS, or you are going to run a network OS and a middleware on top that's going to take care of some of these aspects for us. Okay? So you essentially have this progression from, on the one hand, you have a distributed OS, okay, that's going to essentially run on a bunch of machines, make it look like one machine, and you have on the other hand a network OS, essentially independent machines that just can talk to one another. And the middleware layer of OS is somewhere in between, takes a network OS, tries to make it look like a distributed OS. Okay? So that's essentially what the operating system in a distributed world is going to look like. We are going to focus mostly on network operating system and middleware so that you can see how OSs treat distributed systems. Okay? Next time. Okay? So today we run out of time, so we're going to stop here and we'll continue our discussion next week. Okay?